All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Why LARP Needs Polyamory Representation. My name is Acata Felton. I use she, her pronouns, and I will be kind of sort of leading this conversation. But I've got two other wonderful folks here with me. Kate, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. So my name's Kate, and I use she, they pronouns, and I'm also doing this presentation. Sharon, do you want to go?
And I'm Sharone, and I use they, them pronouns. And also doing this presentation. I don't know what else to say.
I know. Should we talk a little bit about like what we actually or something like that?
Yeah.
Probably a good idea.
Sure.
Just like a brief intro of each of us. As you can see, it's 11 o'clock at night, y'all, and on the East Coast. So this is very very professional.
Yep.
I guess I could say. Sure, I can. So yeah, this is about. So my Kate. I guess what do I do? I am a LARP designer, organizer, community manager. I run a crew called Larp Shack down in Durham, North Carolina, with Jason Morningstar, and also help Acata out with which you'll probably can talk a little bit more about, with a great group called LARP Core, which is LARP Community Organizers Retreat. And then I just write a bunch of games, and that's like write some Golden Cobras, write some Intercon games. Apparently, yes, I won a Golden Cobra last night, which was very exciting. And also going to be helping run my kind of first weekend LARP called Uncanny Valley, happening in June, hopefully in Minnesota in 2022. So I'll talk more about that later if people want to know more about that. It has nothing to do with poly, though it is going to be very poly. Like, it's a summer camp for adults, and yeah, there's going to be a lot of poly stuff going on. So
Good. Sharon, you want to take it away?
Hi. So I have been LARPing, writing, and writing games for. Sorry, I'm hearing feedback from somewhere. But I've been writing and running games for 15 plus years. I've lost track of how long. Of course, I think all of us are poly, which is a good thing to state. And I also wrote a game called Pod Dancing, which deals with an alien race and culture with multiple genders, in which sets of 4 is actually the expectation, and dealing with what it would look like poly and things like that in that culture was a big part of it. And I believe that was the main reason I was asked to be part of this panel.
It is
Acata.
the first reason I thought of you. That is not the only reason I want you here.
Fair.
So, as Kate alluded to, I do help organize something called LARP Core, which is the LARP Community Organizers Retreat. It is, for the most part, online because it was mostly conceived of during and once the pandemic had started. It's international at this point, which is super cool. It is supported by the LARP community, by the Luminary Roleplay Society, which is the LARPing nonprofit I run out in the San Francisco Bay Area with the rest of my board. I've been LARPing since 2012, so about 9 years. And something I'm super excited to talk about tonight is a little bit more about non-monogamy in LARPing. Just to kind of make sure we're all on the same page, Kate, do you think you can help us out with kind of a definition we're going to be using for the panel?
Yes, I can, since I was the one who wrote it, cribbing delightfully from many dictionaries. So the way we are defining non-monogamy is being open to or currently engaged in multiple relationships, generally of a romantic nature, doesn't have to be, with the consent of all involved parties. So that is our general definition of what we were discussing. The other thing we wanted to talk and make sure that we point out is that while we will be talking a good amount about poly representation and non-monogamous representation, and then also possibly about queer representation of relationships in games, because They are both things that we feel maybe do not get represented as much as they could be. We want to be very clear that being queer is not the same as being poly, and one can be queer and not poly, and one can be poly and not queer. These are not the same thing, even if we do have some conversations that overlap. So that is our definition for everyone who. That is what we'll be using as our baseline for the conversation.
Perfect. All right. So I guess I'm kind of sort of facilitating, also chatting, but I'm going to be throwing out some questions to folks. This one goes out both to Kate and Sharone, and also to anyone in the chat who's got some thoughts on this. What's your favorite game that you've played that had some sort of non-monogamy in it?
Just thinking about that. Do you want to go for it, Sharone?
See, the main thing I've done is the one I wrote. Most of the time I've dealt with non-monogamy in LARP, it's places where it's been kind of character driven rather than written into the game. And so I wish I could answer that question better, but I cannot think of a game where I played a poly character where it was actively, explicitly a poly character.
What about
you?
I think that my favorite, so I've read a lot of games that have poly characters explicitly in them. I have unfortunately not had a chance to play many of them. I have attempted to, my favorite game to read is definitely Save Some Light for Me by Evan Turner. I really want to run that game because it's about like 1980s cartoon characters saving the world and all being very poly. And one of the characters has a head that's a light bulb. I don't know, but it sounds great. But so my favorite game probably that I've played though is actually Event Horizon, which is a weekend-long LARP. And that game did explicitly have my character have multiple relationships written into the character sheet, and went really, really well and very interesting. And I really enjoyed that game. As Event Horizon is a weekend-long LARP that no longer runs, but it was on the West Coast, and then mostly on the West Coast, 1 year on the East Coast, Space LARP. There was a lot of explicit polyamory in that game, written in, and very expected of most of the cultures. So that was really great, and especially expected in the culture that Acata played in at 1 year and I played in, which was New Gear and the Gearan culture, which was heavily poly and had triads explicitly often. So that was really great to see that written right in. I thought it was really well done. So that's probably my favorite.
Yeah.
I have to take it back. I just remembered Super Queeros, where I had a character who was written as being interested in two people and hoping that I could figure out making them poly, which did, I believe, happen in my run. So it wasn't explicitly it had to go that way, but it was my character was in love and didn't want to choose.
Very good. Awesome.
It was a game I played on a Sunday morning, so I wasn't really awake, which is part of why I didn't think in my head quite as well. But actually, the game I met some really, really, really wonderful people who have been core to things since then.
What about you, Acata?
Yes.
So, I mean, I kind of have to tag Event Horizon 2 as well, because I'm with Sharone that I've never really played a game where I had a character that was written as poly in like for games that have really pre-written characters. Even my Event Horizon characters, we submitted characters to them.
Yeah.
So they created a world that had a lot of expectation for polyamory to be very mainstream, but a lot of us who were playing poly characters did so of our own drive rather than from like the concept of the writers. So part of why I thought we should talk about it this weekend is I would like to see more games that do this because I think it's cool. Speaking of which, let's see. We've kind of touched on games that both have specific focuses on like polyamory or on relationships. And then there are games for which like relationships happen just part of what's going on. is there can the two of you think of any reason that we would want to approach these games differently, or do we think they should be treated similarly?
A lot depends, I feel like, on if relationships happening are player driven versus written in. And so there is, of course, the full romance LARP. Then there's the games in which romance and relationships are big motivators, but it's not explicitly a romance game. And then there's, of course, games that just there are some characters who may be in relationships, and sometimes people just kind of get together because that's the way things go. And I think a lot depends on whether it's inherently written in versus a player choice. But I would say otherwise, thinking about specifically romance games versus games that also include romance are both games to think of similarly. Personally, that you should be thinking about all of these other different relationship styles, not just, you know, so that includes things like queer relationships, which includes ace relationships, another thing we were saying that we like never see, and poly relationships, again, those being separate, but both important and both things that a lot of us live and would like to get to play more.
Absolutely. Kate, do you have any thoughts?
So I think when intentional game design, like when it's different to like rewriting a game like explicitly about poly, or which is just kind of in generally about like can include, I think Sharone wrote a lot of it, but I do think that there's a few other ways to kind of approach them differently, and I feel like the big thing is like as a writer to be pretty, if you want non-monogamy to be a part of your game and to be a core part of your game, you need to, not, you can't just write it in the characters, but I honestly think that it's good to have it included somehow mechanically, because or something around it, because or scenes that explicitly address it, right? If you're running a game that is scene based or things like that, because mechanics are, if you involve a mechanic, if you create a mechanic or a scene, people know, oh, this is something I'm supposed to engage in. That's like, kind of core to game design. Is if you have a mechanic, people are going to try to use it. Usually, but it usually indicates it's something important. And so, like, I was thinking about games like there's a game called More Than Two, which is a European game in which polyamory is represented, and you actually represent the polyamory by tying strings from yourself to another person, and the way you hold that string is indicating the kind of relationship you have, like the tension in it, and like that, is like clearly making this a thing you have to engage with and you have to physically engage with. And I think that when you're doing something like that, if you're going to be trying to write a game about poly, and I think that that's awesome, making that a core part, or I think pod dancing does the very similar thing. Like you're making that a core part of your mechanic gameplay, and that kind of makes it essential to how you interact. Whereas if you're just having poly as a part, I think it's really important to understand you don't need that as much. You can write it into characters if it's interesting. But you really want, the big thing there is like just making sure that people know that poly is okay, right? And that it's part of the world space. So you want to write, if you want people to explore poly, even if it's not essential to your game or it's not about poly, you need to be explicit. You really do need to be explicit that non-monogamy is okay. We're writing characters that are non-monogamous. If you want to make a non-monogamous relationship, that's okay. You're usually going to not want to, unless you want that, again, a key part of your game. You're usually not going to want to like set up a huge tension, like, oh, it's hugely bad to be non-monogamous, you might die, unless like you seriously really want that tension. But like those are kind of like my thoughts of like the difference about like making a game explicitly about poly and thinking about that intentionally, and then making a game that includes poly, but is not necessarily like this game is about polyamory or non-monogamy. I don't know. Thoughts? I saw
Sharone,
I have to
Sharone like
apologize because
laughing.
I was sitting here giggling. The reason I was sitting here giggling is I completely agree with you, 100%. But the first run of pod dancing, so we have some character again. You have 4 genders. Pods of 4 are expected. We have some characters who are set to not want to be in full force. They're like in love with just one person or whatnot. And we have some people who are geared to want to be in what's called an abundant pod, which is more than 4. Um, our first run of it, almost every pod ended up being abundant. And we actually had to go, oh, everyone went for the poly solution. And that's not, we want people to actually, it's not actually meant to be everyone is okay with this at the same level. It's kind of meant to be more on our world level where some people, yes, totally are, and some people are like, not for me. And we had to go back and write into a few sheets some attitudes against it from a few different for a few people where it would make sense that their characters would not want abundancy or would be against it for some people who would be against it because their family were against it, but really it was the right answer for them, and some people who would be against it for personal reasons. And again, making sure there are some characters who are explicitly for it. Um, we actually had to go back and adjust for the fact that we were playing with a crowd because the game inherently appeals to people who are already, you know, in different structures of relationship. And we got a lot of poly players. A lot of people thought of that as an option. And we were like, huh, we have to actually work the other way so that there's a little bit more thinking. And we also made sure in future runs to be more explicit that not ending up with a relationship was okay and might be the right answer for some characters. That to remember that there was no world saying you have to end up in a relationship, even though this is a matchmaking game. That yes, some characters will have their punishment because there are a few characters, and we have a whole set of like questionnaire trigger questions and questionnaire of which of these things are you okay with or not. Here's content. What level are you good with engaging in it? But there are a few characters who, if they come back unpotted, might get disowned, or might lose some inheritance, or will just be forced to go back the next year. You know, so some characters have family and personal reasons, but there is no, the world says no, you can't do this. There will be another there will be another pod dance in half a year. But so we had to like actually correct for that. Everyone decided to be poly, even characters who probably shouldn't have been, and think more about that one. So.
All right, so
You
we
think
touched
you met a
on
paradox?
all right, so we touched a little bit on this. The idea of some games have pre-written characters and some have characters that are created by the players. I did want to kind of circle back to that. Do we think that there are any other considerations that we want that like a designer or a game writer should keep in mind that applies to one or the other only or both? Like we talked about, like, oh, it should be explicit. Is there anything else that we should keep in mind? So I'm going to give the two of you a moment to think. I'm going to answer this question in the meantime, which is that for me, so I mostly write games that have pre-written characters rather than games where other people are going to create characters and put them in this world. And I find that while, like, so as I think we mentioned, like, all of us are poly in various capacities in our own lives, that because it feels very natural to me, I kind of have this like confused moment in which I have monogamous players go, I don't know what to do with this. And so kind of remembering to like back up and have that education as well is really important to making sure that the intention of a poly relationship actually manifests in game.
I was actually just curious. Sorry about. I had a follow up question for you. How do you do that kind of intentional education? I'm interested in how you do that.
I mean, it starts with things like the definition that we had at the beginning of this presentation. That telling people this is a thing and it is part of the world, and some of your characters are going to associate as that. And so, like, that sets your expectations. And expectation setting, as we've said a couple of times, kind of broken record of, I think, of many game writers and runners, is set your expectations well. As kind of as like cliche as it is, comparisons, sometimes takes comparisons. Like, if you had more than one child, do you love only one of them? But sometimes, even if it's like, even if some of us might find it a little cringeworthy to make some of those comparisons, it's often the touchstone that monogamous players need to kind of take that half step into a new into a different experience.
Also, I cut off you, Sharone, so I'm going to let you talk.
So what I was going to say actually was that setting expectations, I think, is a really important thing. Use your blurb. If you're doing pre-written, like a lot of us do, mine are primarily pre-written as well, the questionnaire is such a huge part. So if you have, for me, if I have both poly and monogamous relationships in a game, I'm going to ask a question about, how comfortable are you in portraying these types of relationships? Similarly, I'm going to be asking questions about, what are you comfortable with gender-wise? What are your character comfortable with as your character play? Things like that. Partly because one of the important things for me is, I'll be honest and say that sometimes if I get someone who's turns out to be a little bit bigoted, I would love to make them play a style they are less comfortable with. But number one, it's not really fair to them, but it's extra not fair to the person who's probably going to get ignored that they're cast with. And so in a lot of ways, it's really important to me to make sure that everyone is taken into account. And so similarly, let's say you have someone who's cast, 3 people who are cast to be in a triad, and two people actually are monogamous and not really comfortable with that. That third person, one of the people might get left out, and just be kind of pushed out of the plot. So I think both setting expectations in your blurb, this is what your game includes, making sure people can self-select for what they want, but also the questionnaire, the checking what people are going to be okay with, and using that when you're casting your players is, I think, really, really important. So.
Absolutely.
I was going to say, so I think I write games that have either very, very short pre-written characters, or none, or basically just like question, like, let's make characters kind of together, let's answer some questions, things like that in play. No pre-testing. So I feel like with those games, when I've written them that I want to have poly as an option, it's really important to make that explicit in the relation, like the questions that I ask. So like if we're asking questions, or like what I will often do is have basically like relationship building right within the game. Like this person is in this relationship with you, and this person's in this kind of relationship with you. But I almost always provide examples of what the kind of relationship could look like. And I think it's really important then for me to include, because I have a lot of queer relationships in my games, to include both examples of poly relationships if I want that, and examples of queer relationships as things that people can choose or develop as examples, because that just basically clues players in to the idea, oh, this is okay. This is something that I can choose to do in that. Because otherwise, my crew, I will say, my LARP chat crew is extremely poly. Incredibly poly. So often they're going to kind of default to that behavior. In general, we have a problem we call the LARP Shack problem, which we were talking a little bit earlier, which is like we've written games that have romantic tension. Oh, everyone's just deciding they can all just date. That's fine. That's cool, but that's what we're doing now. So that's kind of a different problem, but making it explicit, especially for if you're going outside of your group that you know is very poly comfortable, and you are taking this to a different audience, publishing it, or et cetera, having those kinds of examples for non-pre-written characters is really important.
Absolutely. So I guess Kate, you kind of touched on this a little bit about like how you design your games with these questions to help people be thinking about and creating like respectful polyamorous or non-monogamous relationships. Uh, since we've got 3 writers here, is there anything that like are there tips or tricks that like you can think of that you like would want to share with someone who's like, hey, I want to write a game that has polyamory in it. How do I do this? Or are there any like kind of like I guess like tropes or stereotypes that you kind of look at and go, no, I'm explicitly not putting that in this game, but then the players don't ever see those. So like, how do we warn people what not to do?
If you're not poly, get someone who is to talk about it. I mean, it's one of those things in general about sensitivity readers, but like tropes to avoid, unicorn hunting, the couple looking for their third. Big one. There's a lot of different types of poly. And so if you're not actually poly yourself, I would say talk to people who are. Talk about the different types of relationships, talk about what you want from your game, and really work with someone who knows those styles. Because there are a lot of stereotypes out there of greedy or that they all look certain ways. Triads are the things that are especially publicized out there. Triads are closed groups, and poly is one of those things you see all the time in media. And for a lot of us, like I am dating multiple people and none of them are dating each other. They're all dating other people who aren't dating. I think somewhere in there's a like entire closed loop of people dating people, dating people, dating people, dating people. And like somewhere it closes back up with one of my sets. But it's not that anyone involved is like crossing over or that everyone's dating each other. It just happens to be a line that happened to cross back up somewhere over there on step number 50. And so I guess you could call it more of the V. This person is dating these 2 people at the same time, but also then that would split off and there might be a third person. It's the polycule. There's a reason it's because it looks like molecules. Um, but so like if you're going to include triads, great. That is a poly style. But think about what other types of poly you can include. Think about making sure that again, sensitivity writers, think about the fact you can be poly and ace. That is one of those things where people often equate relationships with sex, and that same thing happens in games. Where even if sex isn't, written into the game, it still is a thing that's kind of vaguely implied in many relationship games. You can, and so there's all of those different things about those interplays that I think are really important to bring into your games. And yeah, basically avoiding stereotypes, talk to people who actually are the thing, just in general, I think is one of my big ones.
Sure.
So,
Kate, do you have any thoughts you want to add?
That was really, really great. I guess the only thing I'd say is one of the things that I've seen and I've not seen this in every game I've seen exclusively about poly, but a lot of things I've seen is just like the poly can be super messy. Like it really can, right? You got a lot of folks who are like all dating other folks, and like I always said that like after I became poly, like my ability to have to talk about relationships and talk about feelings got like so much more muscle. But so that's 100% true. But they also are just other relationships. So I would say don't constantly lean on the fact that some games I've seen lean very heavily on them like these are full of drama and very, very messy all the time. And I'm like, oh, no, not really. So, like, I know it's good gameplay, but think about them like you would write any other relationship in a game, right? Like, they're just like any other relationship, and I would avoid the idea that all poly relationships are like disaster bombs of drama. because they're not, and if they were, they wouldn't actually exist. So just like I think that's a stereotype that I have seen. I've also seen some that talk about poly almost as cheating, and just remember that that's not what it is. And if you're writing a game about cheating, it is not a game about polyamory. That's non-consensual. Even if you're having multiple people date to each other. So just I've seen that before, and I just would. And some people are like, "This is a game about poly," and I'm like, "No, that's a game about cheating. those are different things." So those are just two of the things I would say to pay attention to, in addition to what Sharone said, which is, I say is like really important. Like I did have a good friend who wrote a game I really love called Deep Love, about poly, and he is not poly, and he did a very good job of talking to the large amount of his friends who are poly. This is Jason Morningstar's game Deep Love, and did a really great job of like capturing it and talking to people about what it was like. So go that route. Don't if you're not poly, and it can be done. It's a good thing to do. But yes, talk to people. Do you have anything to add, Acata?
I do, actually, which is kind of the other end of the extreme that you just described, Kate, is that in a lot of media and a lot of like conversations that that folks I know who are poly are trying to have with monogamous folks, tendency to downplay the fact that sometimes there is drama and complication, because you just know that there's going to be pushback on the concept or the lifestyle if you admit that it's not perfect. And that I think that is also a pitfall that people can fall into, is the idea that like if you're going to write a polyamorous relationship, it has to be perfect. It has to look perfect. Otherwise, it's going to fall apart completely. And that, well, people are nuanced, and there's more there than just drama or everything is, perfect, deity level communication with each other, able to read each other's minds and all of that. But yeah, if you talk to real polyamory folks, you would probably find this out.
I think Kate nailed it in saying that poly relationships are relationships. So
agreed. All right. So we've spent, the first maybe half hour here chatting mostly about LARP, because that's what I write. That's my understanding of most of what Kate writes. I actually know a little bit less about what Sharone writes, but I'm going to take a wild guess here. So
yeah, I'm very LARP set. Love other stuff. Don't write it.
Sure. So I don't know how many folks we might have in the chat, but if anyone has knows of games that are outside of LARP, like tabletops or even like video games and so forth, that explore non-monogamy in some way, like super interested to hear folks. Sharone, you got a thought?
I've just got to say, I've been playing Hades recently a lot over time, and Hades, my favorite thing about it is there are 3 romanceable characters. None lock the others out at all. And not only that, there's there's conversation. It doesn't just ignore it either. There are conversations that some of the characters have with each other about it. Zagreus, I just in the game I played this morning had a conversation with Meg about her being okay that he's also saying Thanatos, and I was just like over the moon about the fact that not only does it not make you choose, it doesn't just ignore that is happening. The characters talk about it. And I can't think of another game I played, especially with the exposure that Hades has gotten, like that. So, RPGs, I know there are some indie ones out there. I don't know specifics, and I hope that some more people in chat might know.
Yep. So if it's finding some of these, or Kate, if you know them.
I was going to say, I just saw someone linked to in the chat, because I've been following the chat. Hello, chat friends! There is a, I think this is a tabletop game, someone linked in chat called Exquisite Polycule, which is an itch.io game. Polyamorous romantic comedy game for 3 to 6 players. Yes, it's a tabletop RPG. Create a cast of characters from a randomized list of attributes and tell their love story by playing scenes in a 5-act structure. So pencil, paper, dice, and your imagination. So that is game. Another game I would say in the tabletop world that I am obsessed with and currently playing a long campaign of is Thirsty Sword Lesbians. That is an awesome game, tabletop game, and explicitly encourages polyamory as a form of, because I mean, come on, you gotta duel and flirt and kiss as many people as you can. That's the goal. At least that's my goal when I play the game. I don't know if that's actually the full goal, but that's my goal. But I would say as a tabletop RPG, it's a very obviously explicitly queer game, and also a very explicitly poly game. So would highly recommend folks looking at a good example of both of those to look at Thirsty Sword Lesbians. Thirsty Sword Lesbians. It also is a great title.
I'm gonna say for board games, there's a way in which I'd be actually wary about board games. Like RPGs, all similar things with LARP, definitely. But partly like I can only think of one board game I played that gets relationship-y at all, which is Slash. Which is about, picking which ridiculous pairings make the most sense to you and writing stories about it. Basically, it's kind of fan fiction, the card game. But I can't really think of board games that really are relationship-y outside of like life, which and I'd be, I don't know, worried about commodize. Oh God, I cannot think of the word I'm trying to look for. Commodifying. Thank you. The way that I could see relationships ending up being commodified and what that would mean for poly in a board game. So like, I'm trying to think of ways that it would work. And I guess similar to relationships, that's not something I typically see in board games much, except for like backstory to board games. Like, Sentinels of the Multiverse has huge amounts of lore that go into the background of it, some of which does include relationships and such, and in fact has a polycule. Speaking of which, if anyone who doesn't know, Sentinels of the Multiverse, the oh God, what is their name? It's a set of Egyptian gods, are actually a polycule with each other. But that's the only way I can really think of relationships and poly entering into board games. And if someone in chat or if either of you have a thought about that, that would be different. I would love to hear.
I've seen relationships in board games, but I have not seen poly relationships in all the board games I've played. So I don't quite know. Like Love Letter is the game that I think about.
Okay.
But that's very explicitly,
I know, I've never played it.
That's very explicitly not poly. You have to choose. Someone comes out. Someone in the Meta Paradox 11, which is Olivia. Hi, Olivia. Posted another LARP, but Together Forever folks. They posted a polyamory version of the game, and they posted a link to it. And then we also, it's not explicitly in the setup, but I played Lady Blackbird with various poly relationships at various games, which is another classic, great indie tabletop game. I mean, I feel like most Powered by the Apocalypse games lend themselves well to polyamory. Monster Hearts is another one. But that will just be, you're just going to be terrible to each other, but you're going to be terrible to each other all the time, and it doesn't matter what kind of relationship you're in. You're a bunch of teenagers. It's just going to be awful.
A little bit.
That is what we've got so far the chat.
All right. So we touched on, Sharone, you'd mentioned the idea that like trying to figure out how to put polyamory in a board game maybe give you a little bit of pause about like how it might be treated poorly. Now that we do have a list of at least a couple of tabletops, which I know all of us play, even if we don't write them regularly. We run them, we play in them. Are there any considerations there that we'd like to kind of throw out either for, playing them or writing them or running them?
Um, I mean, I think that for me, a lot of board games are so much about your players and the GM and what the narrative you're creating together. I think a lot of it I don't GM much, but I have GM'd a couple times. I mostly play. But one of the things is, what do your players want, or what do you as a player want? And talking with your fellow players, and are there relationships within the other players? You know, if so, that's probably going to take some working together to create it, or letting it develop naturally. Or are you, there is, of course, the slutty bard paired uh, stereotype and such. But, or are you a character who might have relationships? And again, I think a lot of that is so much talking with your group and setting up what your expectations are, what you might want to get out of it. If you don't want relationships to be part of your game, making that explicit. If you want relationships to be part of the game, just it's so much of that is that setting up with your players and your group there. Um, I do think that, I guess, if you were writing a game and you want it to be an explicit possibility, kind of what Kate said about really laying it out, um, and making sure it is explicitly there, I guess, in the rules and in the however you talk about relationships in that game.
Mhm.
But yeah, I think that's my answer there.
I just wanted to also say from the chat that another
Yeah.
person mentioned that Good Society, which is one of my favorite games, it's a Jane Austen RPG, tends to wind up with polycules, surprisingly. So that's an interesting game, actually, in which you can set, and actually talking about expectations, I think is a really good example. You actually can set different levels in that game. You can set it to be extremely historically accurate, um, and really following the societal rules of the time. Or you can really dial it wherever you want and be like, yeah, polycules are fine, but it has very explicit rules at the beginning of doing that level setting about where you're interested in going. And I think that kind of speaks to what we were also talking about. Is like, if you're writing a tabletop game, I think it's great that something like Good Society, Thirsty Sword Lesbians has it as well. Have that like built into the rules. Be like, have a session 0 and do this calibration, and here's kind of a way you can do it. Because that really is a great way to if it is important to you, which I think it is for a lot of game groups. It makes it puts it in a way where it's more explicit, and you kind of feel like you can't get out of it because it's in the rules. So that's, I don't write tabletops because they're scary. People tell me they're not, but I don't believe that. But from what I've run and really like, that's what I've seen. I think works really well is that very explicit expectation setting written into the gaming text itself.
Yeah. So something I wanted to follow up, I think Sharone, you might have mentioned it, that like a lot of tabletops that I've played that do kind of the like, let's create our characters and create our relationships, do it in a very like one at a time way. That it's like, all right, so now you're in the relationship building phase of your like building characters. Create one connection with this character and one connection with that character. And by doing them in a very binary way, that it's you're creating a connection between two characters here and two characters there and two characters someplace else, that it makes it a little bit harder to drive towards polyamorous relationships unless you've had that conversation before you get to that phase.
Mm-hmm.
Because otherwise, especially on a mixed table, I'm actually curious if you two have had similar experiences, but like if I'm sitting at a mixed table with folks who I know who are polyamorous and I know who are monogamous, I find myself in kind of this weird position where I'm like, all right, well, I can put a connection together with the other person at the table who's polyamorous, but if the folks who are monogamous then see that as an exclusion to them also having one, then it's hard to create that representation at the table either.
Yeah, like I'm thinking about it. And I haven't really done that with relationships as much as games that you're still, just building their bonds and you're like I did that with your faculty at an evil university. And it was that you have one person you have a good connection with and one person you have like a bad connection with. Um but no, thinking about that, especially that kind of thing, it really is geared to have one-on-one things, be they actual, be they relationships or friendships or bad history. And huh, I think it would be really interesting. I'm not because again, this isn't the kind of game I typically write, so it's not the kind of thing I've really thought about yet. Um, but I think that's a really interesting to think about. If you want to allow for poly in those sorts of games, you would need to set that up in a very different way.
So like Kate
Or,
mentioned,
any kind of tied relationships.
very, very early that having mechanics that support these things
Mm-hmm.
can go a long way to kind of give people the scaffolding or the structure to figure out how to set those up.
Especially if you want those to be set up before play. So I think that often you do have these like one-on-one relationships, and then like what I've often seen if you've got those is that the polyamory will come in during the game and develop organically. But especially if you want those preset before the game, which is often why if I have a game that I'm really interested in having that kind of a thing, I will at least do 3 relationship questions, and I'll let people choose the same. It's not going to be like so, like in the game I just wrote, or games I've written, you can definitely choose the same person. As maybe be like, I have a crush on this person. Well, so do I, and we both are in a relationship with this person. Okay, great. Let's figure out how that goes, because that lets that more organically kind of start at the beginning. It's not that like as exclusive, but of course that's also challenging, which is why I often do like 3 relationship questions, and then the relationship building section gets really long. So then you're like, oh God, what do I do? And then people say you don't need as much. And then you're like, but I want more relationships to set that kind of thing up. So it is kind of a challenge and a choice of like, how do you do that and give that space? Because it's going to take longer.
But
Or
like I
because,
can see, sorry, don't
yeah,
want to interrupt.
no.
I can see that if there wasn't that extra question, that I would be nervous to have a poly relationship go in a game where it hadn't had that conversation and I didn't know if the other people would be there. Um like I would not want to have that situation where, again, like I said, like I'd be wanting to do a poly thing and accidentally especially if I don't know the people, accidentally end up in going with people who are really only okay with monogamy. So I think that, yeah, without setting it up in advance, I would be really nervous in a kind of make your own character and make your own relationships game. So, um, yeah, I
Sure.
like the idea of those extra questions specifically to do it, or at least some sort of check in and what are people okay with at the very least. Um, because again, otherwise, I'm going to default to monogamy and LARP partly to protect myself more than anything else, even though I would prefer to play poly. There's that side of I don't want to get burned because I went for the poly.
Feel you on that real hard. We don't have a whole lot of time left. I wanted to kind of take a pause. I'm sure we could talk about this until these two fall asleep. I'm on the West Coast, so I've got a few more hours in me. But if the chat has any questions that they wanted to field or any thoughts that they like gotta share, I want to make sure there's time and space for that. I know I've got a couple of folks watching the chat. I don't know that we've had any questions come in, but
I've not seen the question, no.
okay. Well, if anyone's got one,
Uh,
feel free.
Olivia has been talking about the amazing sounding magical girl tabletop that she's been working on, um,
I'm
which
very
sounds amazing.
very
But
excited to see that
yeah,
come.
no question.
That's all right. Well,
Yep.
if they think of any, in the meantime, I'll pitch another one to the two of you, I think. Unless one of the two of you has something. Let's see. I guess kind of a premise that I just kind of assumed coming into this, that is that having non-monogamy in games is good. So something I guess I want to like ask the two of you is like, what does bringing non-monogamy into a game do for a game? How does it change or improve the design space or the possibility space? Why do we want to explore these things? What's interesting or valuable or useful about it?
I have an answer. Okay. I think there are two big things for me. One of which is for people who are open to learning. Again, there's that question of making sure that people are selecting for wanting to play it or being open to it, exposing them to these possibilities and the way it works and the fact that these are things that exist. But another one is just in general, letting people play the things they are and the things they do. Opening our LARP worlds to mimic the real world, I think is really important. Similarly, with bringing in queer relationships, it's not just about exposing other people, it's about letting queer people be queer, including in LARP. It's about letting polyamorous people be polyamorous. For whatever reason people LARP, we have so many different ones, so I don't want to speak to other people. But for me, sometimes getting to work through those emotions in a game space, and let them out and come out. Like, I'm a bleed player. I love working through hardships in games. I love angst in games. But I think it's really important to give representation for people, both in terms of showing that these things exist, but also just letting people play what exists. So yeah.
I was going to say, and we actually did a question, so I'm going to answer very quickly and then go. We do have a question, so that's cool. But I was going to say that for me, pretty much everything that Sharone said, but also I just think that it's important that LARPs represent life. And also, personal story. I still remember my first Intercon, and I wasn't playing a polyamorous relationship, but I really recognized that when I was playing this game called Magpie, had a romance, a triangle that I desperately wanted to just do polyamorous, but I wasn't myself polyamorous. But the fact that I was like, why is this character not doing it? Why am I not doing this? Was like a huge questioning point for me. And then I played a few games with polyamory, including New World Magic School, which I'll give a shout out to, also being very open and welcoming to polyamory play. And that honestly made me go, oh crap, I'm actually polyamorous. So I also think it's important to be able, just like I think that others, numerous people who have realized that they have different gender identities through playing LARP, or queer through playing LARP. I think I'm also a person who believes in exploring oneself through LARP. And I think that being open and exploring these kinds of relationships and presenting them out there, it's not saying you have to be this, but it's a really useful thing and a good thing to expose yourself to kind of understand yourself in a way. So that is my personal testament.
That's good. All right. Who wants to read our question from the chat?
I can. So many of the relationships I write, this is from I write in Secrets of Power LARPs. So I'm going to let this give to people who actually write these games, are dysfunctional in some ways for dramatic reasons. Are there particular dysfunctionalities I should avoid writing with regard to poly relationships for sensitivity reasons? I don't write Secrets of Powers games, so.
I mean, I think this is probably more general than just Secrets of Powers. We've already touched on what I think is probably the biggest one is polyamory is not the same thing as cheating. So don't do that. It is possible to have someone who is polyamorous and in an ethical way, but within those relationships, I suppose. But then how, like, okay, I just talked myself into a corner. I'm gonna start over. It is possible to have someone who has one relationship that they are acting as if it is an ethical polyamorous relationship, but they are cheating with someone else. Mm-hmm. That it is possible to be in a polyamorous framework and also be cheating. Mm-hmm. Other than that, I can't think of any that really strike me, but I don't know what the two of you think.
I would say again, poly is relationships. It's about relationships. And as long as you are as long as poly isn't the dysfunction, typical relationship dysfunctions within the relationships and the bounds there, we have them just as much. And there are some you can pull out in poly that you're dealing with that you can't otherwise. So like the issue of hierarchy versus non-hierarchy. There are different poly styles that causes tension. Couples privilege within poly is very dysfunctional. And especially as long as you're playing that as a negative thing and that this is a dysfunction, there are ways to play that up. But I think a lot of it is really about just remembering that poly relationships are also relationships. And like I think Acata said earlier, don't paint that we're not perfect. Our relationships are not perfect. So don't have poly be the perfect relationship, especially if you're talking about dysfunction in relationships in general. But again, the sensitivity read as well. If you want to do that, it can be very helpful.
Yep.
Say like if you're Oops, sorry. I was gonna say if you're doing a secrets of any kind of game, I would say, and you're writing like pre-written characters, just like make sure that like your poly characters and your non-poly characters, if you have both have dysfunctions in their relationship. Those kind of the opposite. Just so like everyone's dysfunctional, y'all. So that's what makes it fun. So just make sure that you like balance that across. I also want to just do a reading. Someone said wanted to just do this for Sharone. For the record, I'm giggling a little because of the number of people I know who played pod dancing and came out as non-cis after I have recognized this in my own group of people who have played pod dancing. So, yeah.
That's amazing. For the record, that was me who said that. I'm
okay.
coming on you.
But anyway, I actually have a few friends who have said that too, so can testify.
So we are going to want to kind of wind down here.
Yeah.
I'm going to do once around for if there's what's the last thing you want to leave with our audience, and then we'll do one more. Who are we and where can we find you? Where can we find you on the internet? If Kate, I'm going to put you on the spot. If there's anything you want to leave our audience with.
I guess the only thing I would say is the one thing I hadn't actually mentioned was as a player, if you're also a monogamous player who's not playing a non-monogamous character, I mean, don't do it if it makes you deeply uncomfortable, but give it a shot. It's a pretty fun role to often have. It gives you a lot of space for a lot of great relationship drama. As a person who loves all so much, and yeah, just like go for it and try it out. Right, like don't shy away from it. It's not gonna like turn you poly probably, but just give it a shot. That's what I would say as a player. Be open-minded to it.
Sharone?
I think my big takeaway from this is what I'd said earlier or what we said, I think multiple of us, is that in a lot of ways, LARP relationships should mirror real world. And that's true of polyamorous, that's true of East and Aro relationships, it's true of queer relationships. And that poly really LARP in general should have space for all of these things. And as writers, we really should think about the world. And again, sometimes that means bringing in that extra writer because you're not going to write it well, as well as being aware of what you know and what you don't, I think is an important one. So be aware, bring in that help if you need it, but really let LARP explore the world.
Awesome. And I guess I'm going to leave this very quick. My last thought is that I would recommend don't try and force people to be poly who aren't. That if the game is going to crux on a need for a monogamous solution, that's okay too. Just make sure that's what everybody understands going in. As we wrap up here, once again, my name is Acata. You can find me by looking for the Luminary Roleplay Society just on the internet in general. And I'll talk to the organizers if we can drop my blog in the chat a little bit later. Kate?
My name is Kate. You can find my bad itch.io channel, which I will update shortly, at Borrowed Light, which is my group, and Borrowed Light at itch.io, and Larp Check you can find on Facebook if you're in the Triangle South area or want to do some online play.
Sharone, you want to wrap us up?
You can find me kind of in the intercon groups for LARPing, and if you want to see me talking about and yelling about trans stuff and disabled stuff and all sorts of other activism stuff, I'm here on Twitch as Kamianya. You can see me in the chat, and on Twitter as Kamianya1. Numeral 1, not written out.
Awesome. All right. I think we are all done. If we want to go ahead and